My stepmom destroyed my dead mother's belongings while I was in the hospital. I'm getting revenge. You know that feeling when someone crosses a line they can never uncross? When they take something so precious from you that forgiveness isn't even on the table anymore? Well, that's exactly what happened to me, and what my stepmom did while I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life will make your blood boil. But here's the thing, I didn't just cry about it, I got even. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why revenge isn't always a dish best served cold. Sometimes it needs to be calculated, deliberate, and absolutely devastating. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I'm 23 years old, fresh out of college, and I was living in my childhood home while saving up for my own place. My mom passed away when I was 16 from cancer, and it was the worst thing I'd ever experienced. She was my best friend, my confidant, the person who understood me better than anyone else in the world. Before she died, she gave me a box of her most precious belongings, things she wanted me to have, photos, her jewelry, letters she'd written to me, her favorite books with notes in the margins, and even some of her clothes that still smelled like her perfume. My dad remarried 3 years after Mom died to a woman named Cheryl. At first, I tried to be understanding because Dad seemed happy again, and I wanted that for him. Cheryl was nice enough in the beginning, but there was always something off about her, something calculating behind those fake smiles. She had this way of making little comments about my mom, nothing overtly disrespectful, but enough to let me know she wanted to erase her memory from the house. I kept my mom's things in my bedroom in a special cedar chest that had been my grandmother's, and I made it clear to everyone that those belongings were sacred to me. Fast forward to 6 months ago when I was in a serious car accident. Some idiot ran a red light and T-boned me on the driver's side, and I ended up in the hospital with a broken leg, 3 fractured ribs, and a severe concussion. I was in the ICU for 4 days and then moved to a regular room for another week of recovery. During that entire time, I was on heavy pain medication, drifting in and out of consciousness, completely vulnerable and dependent on others. My dad visited every day, looking worried and guilty, but Cheryl only came twice, and both times she seemed distracted and impatient to leave. When I finally came home, I was still in rough shape, using crutches and needing help with basic tasks. I hobbled into my room, exhausted and in pain, just wanting to collapse into my own bed and be surrounded by familiar things. But the moment I opened my bedroom door, my heart dropped straight through the floor. Everything was different. The furniture had been rearranged, my posters were gone, and worst of all, my mom's cedar chest was missing. I stood there frozen, my hands shaking on my crutches, unable to process what I was seeing. I called out for my dad, my voice cracking with panic and rage. He came running up the stairs with Cheryl trailing behind him, and I could see the guilt written all over his face before he even said a word. That's when Cheryl, with the most casual tone you can imagine, told me she'd cleaned out my room while I was in the hospital because it was cluttered and unhealthy. She said my mom's old things were just taking up space and that it was time to move on from the past. I literally felt like I'd been punched in the gut all over again. I demanded to know where my mom's belongings were, trying to keep my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. Cheryl waved her hand dismissively and said she donated most of it to a thrift store because it was just old stuff anyway. The jewelry, she claimed, she'd taken to a pawn shop because it might as well be useful if it's just sitting in a box. My mom's letters, the photos, her books, all of it gone, thrown away or sold off like garbage. I looked at my dad, waiting for him to say something to defend me, to show some kind of backbone, but he just stood there, looking at the floor like a coward. Something broke inside me at that moment, and it wasn't just my heart. It was my ability to see these people as family, to give them any benefit of the doubt, to care about maintaining peace. Cheryl had violated the most sacred boundary possible, and she'd done it when I was at my most vulnerable, lying in a hospital bed, unable to defend my own possessions. She'd looked at my pain and loss and decided it meant nothing, that her desire for a fresh start was more important than my connection to my dead mother. That kind of cruelty doesn't deserve forgiveness. It deserves consequences. I didn't explode at that moment because I was too shocked and medicated and physically weak. I just turned around, crutched my way back down the stairs, and locked myself in the guest room. My dad tried to talk to me through the door, offering weak apologies and excuses about how Cheryl meant well and was just trying to help. But I knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty from a woman who saw me as competition for my dad's attention and my mom's memory as a threat to her position in the house. Over the next few days, I made some calls to local thrift stores and pawn shops, desperately hoping to recover something, anything of my mom's belongings. I found the pawn shop that had bought the jewelry, but when I went there with the little bit of money I had, they told me everything had already been sold. The thrift stores had no records of donations matching the description, and I realized that Cheryl had probably just thrown most of it in the trash. My mom's letters, her handwriting, her thoughts and love captured on paper, all gone to a landfill. I cried harder that week than I had since her actual funeral. But grief has this funny way of transforming into fuel when you're angry enough. I started researching, planning, thinking about what would hurt Cheryl the most. See, I'd learned a lot about my stepmom over the years, things she thought she'd hidden well. Cheryl was obsessed with appearances, with her social media presence, with being seen as the perfect wife and homemaker. She ran a lifestyle blog and Instagram account where she posted about her perfect life, her beautiful home, her loving family, all carefully curated lies. She had about 40,000 followers and even did some sponsored posts making money off her fake image. I also knew that Cheryl had a past she desperately wanted to keep buried. Before she married my dad, she'd been married to someone else, a marriage that ended badly when she had an affair with her ex-husband's business partner. She'd managed to come out of that divorce looking like the victim, playing up a narrative about emotional abuse that wasn't true. Her ex-husband had told my dad the truth when they'd first started dating, but Dad had chosen to believe Cheryl's version of events, and she'd made him promise never to mention her previous marriage to anyone. It was her biggest secret, the crack in her perfect facade. I spent 3 weeks gathering evidence and planning my revenge. I created anonymous social media accounts and started reaching out to people who knew Cheryl from her previous marriage. I contacted her ex-husband, who was more than happy to share court documents, text messages, and emails that showed the truth about their relationship and divorce. I compiled screenshots of Cheryl's affair, evidence of her lying in court, and proof that she'd manipulated the divorce settlement by hiding assets. Every dirty secret she'd buried, I dug up and documented meticulously. Then I went through Cheryl's social media accounts with a fine-toothed comb. I found all the contradictions, the places where her perfect life posts didn't match reality, photos she'd edited to make our house look bigger and nicer, claims about charity work she'd never actually done, sponsored posts where she lied about products she didn't really use. I also discovered she'd been buying fake followers and engagement, something that violated the terms of service for the company sponsoring her. I documented everything, created a comprehensive file, and prepared for the moment I'd release it all. I also did something more personal and immediate. I went into my dad's home office when both he and Cheryl were out, and I accessed the computer they shared. Cheryl wasn't tech-savvy enough to know about browser history and saved passwords, so I easily got into her email accounts, her blog dashboard, and her social media accounts. I downloaded years of messages, posts, and photos, looking for anything else I could use. That's when I found the emails between her and her sister, where Cheryl openly mocked my dad, called him boring and pathetic, and admitted she'd only married him for financial security. But the most damning thing I found was a series of emails between Cheryl and a friend from 3 days before my accident. In these messages, Cheryl talked about how she was tired of having me in the house, how I was cramping her style, and how she couldn't wait for me to move out. Then, in an email sent the day I was admitted to the hospital, she told this friend that my accident was perfect timing because she could finally clear out all that dead wife shrine stuff. She'd planned it. She'd waited for me to be helpless, and she'd destroyed my mother's memory with premeditation and glee. Reading those emails changed something in me. This wasn't just about getting back at someone who'd wronged me. This was about exposing a genuinely terrible person who'd manipulated everyone around her. My dad deserved to know who he'd really married. Cheryl's followers deserved to know they were being lied to, and I deserved justice for what she'd done. So I finalized my plan, created a timeline, and prepared to systematically dismantle the life Cheryl had built on lies and manipulation. Phase 1 of my revenge started on a Thursday morning. I created a comprehensive website using one of those free blog platforms, and I titled it The Real Cheryl Anderson. I uploaded every piece of evidence I'd gathered, organized by category: court documents about her previous marriage and affairs, proof of her lying about charity work and buying fake followers, screenshots of her mocking my dad in emails, and most importantly, the emails where she celebrated my hospitalization as an opportunity to destroy my mother's belongings. I wrote a detailed narrative explaining who I was, what she'd done, and why I was exposing her. Then I started phase 2, strategic sharing. I sent the website link to every single one of Cheryl's Instagram followers using a carefully crafted message from an anonymous account. I sent it to all the brands that sponsored her, explaining that they were working with someone who committed fraud and misrepresented their products. I sent it to every member of the mom blogger community she was part of, to her friends, to our extended family members, to people at my dad's work, to everyone in her social circle. I made sure that by the end of that day, thousands of people had seen the truth about Cheryl Anderson. The response was immediate and more dramatic than I'd even anticipated. Cheryl's Instagram comments exploded with people calling her out, unfollowing her, and demanding explanations. The brands she worked with terminated their partnerships within hours, some even threatening legal action for fraud and breach of contract. Her ex-husband's lawyer contacted my dad about potential perjury charges related to her divorce testimony. The IRS got involved because she hadn't been reporting her blogging income properly, something I'd also discovered and reported anonymously. Cheryl went from Instagram influencer to unemployed defendant facing multiple legal battles, and she had no one to blame but herself. Every bit of suffering she experienced was the direct result of her own lies, manipulation, and cruelty. My dad filed for divorce exactly 1 week after the truth came out. He was devastated, not just by Cheryl's betrayal, but by his own failure to protect me and my mother's memory. We had a long, painful conversation where I told him how hurt I was that he'd chosen Cheryl over me, that he'd let her destroy the only physical connections I had to Mom. He broke down and apologized, admitting he'd been blind and weak and desperate not to be alone. I didn't forgive him immediately, because trust isn't rebuilt in a day, but I could see he was genuinely remorseful, unlike Cheryl, who was only sorry she'd been caught. The divorce was quick and brutal. Cheryl tried to claim she deserved half of everything, but my dad's lawyer brought up the emails where she admitted to marrying him for money and the evidence of her hiding assets in her previous divorce. She ended up with almost nothing, just her car and her personal belongings, no alimony, no share of the house, nothing. She moved out within a month, and I made sure to be there on moving day, watching from the window as she loaded her things into a U-Haul truck. She looked up at one point and saw me watching, and the hatred in her eyes was so intense I actually smiled and waved. She'd taken everything from me, and I'd returned the favor with interest. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild what Cheryl had destroyed. I put out calls on social media and local community boards explaining what had happened and asking if anyone had accidentally purchased my mother's belongings from thrift stores or pawn shops. Miraculously, a few items made their way back to me. A woman returned one of my mom's necklaces that she'd bought at an estate sale. A man brought back 2 of her books that he'd found at a thrift store, and someone even located a box of photos that had somehow survived. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even most of it, but having those few pieces back felt like getting a small part of my mom returned to me. My relationship with my dad slowly started to heal. He went to therapy to work through his guilt and his pattern of choosing poorly in relationships, and he made genuine efforts to honor my mom's memory in ways he'd neglected for years. We put up photos of her around the house again, something Cheryl had forbidden, and Dad even had her cedar chest replicated by a local woodworker, so I'd have somewhere special to keep the items that had been returned. It wasn't the same as having the original chest filled with all of Mom's things, but it was a start, a symbol that we were trying to rebuild what had been broken. As for Cheryl, last I heard, she'd moved to another state and was working a regular job under her maiden name, trying to escape the infamy of being exposed as a fraud and a cruel manipulator. Her social media accounts were all deleted, her blog was taken down, and she'd essentially been erased from the internet except for the evidence of her lies that still circulates occasionally. She got exactly what she deserved. A life as empty and false as the one she'd tried to project, stripped of all the artificial validation she'd craved. Some people might say I went too far, but those people didn't watch their dying mother's last gifts get thrown away like trash by a woman who felt threatened by a ghost. Looking back on everything that happened, I don't regret a single action I took to expose Cheryl. She violated something sacred, destroyed irreplaceable connections to a person I loved more than anyone in the world, and she did it when I was at my most vulnerable. That kind of cruelty doesn't deserve mercy or forgiveness. It deserves consequences, real, life-altering consequences that make it impossible to pretend you're a good person. I gave Cheryl exactly what she'd given me: loss, pain, and the destruction of something precious. Except in her case, it was the false life she'd built on manipulation and lies. The experience taught me some hard lessons about family, loyalty, and justice. I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you will fail you, and when they do, you have to be willing to protect yourself. I learned that revenge isn't always wrong, especially when it's really about exposure and accountability rather than petty vindictiveness. I learned that standing up for yourself and the memory of those you love is worth any discomfort or conflict it might cause. Most importantly, I learned that my mom's love and influence couldn't be destroyed by someone like Cheryl, no matter how hard she tried, because those things lived in me, in my memories, in who I'd become. Today, I'm in a much better place. I moved into my own apartment 6 months ago, and I decorated it with the few items of my mom's that were returned to me, along with new photos and mementos that honor her memory. My dad and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, and he's committed to never letting anyone disrespect Mom again. I've even started dating someone who understands the importance of my mom's memory and supports my need to keep her presence alive in my life. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and it's built on truth rather than lies. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about destroying Cheryl's life, and my answer is always the same. I didn't destroy her life, I exposed it. Everything that happened to her was the result of her own choices, her own lies, her own cruelty. I just made sure those choices had consequences, that her lies were revealed, and that her cruelty didn't go unpunished. If she'd been a decent person, if she'd respected boundaries and treated me with basic human kindness, none of this would have happened. But she chose to be cruel, and cruelty, when properly documented and strategically exposed, tends to destroy itself. The final chapter of this story is actually about forgiveness, but not the kind you might expect. I've forgiven my dad because he owned his mistakes, did the work to change, and proved through actions that he was genuinely sorry. But I'll never forgive Cheryl because she never once apologized for what actually mattered, destroying my mother's belongings. She apologized for getting caught, for the lies being exposed, for losing her lifestyle, but never for the cruelty at the heart of it all. And honestly, I don't need her apology anyway, because my revenge was better than any apology could ever be. So that's my story, the tale of how my stepmom destroyed my dead mother's belongings while I was fighting for my life in a hospital, and how I systematically dismantled her entire existence in return. Some people will think I went too far, that I should have taken the high road, that revenge is never the answer. But those people didn't lose what I lost, didn't feel what I felt, didn't have to watch a cruel woman smile while erasing their mother from existence. For me, exposing Cheryl wasn't just revenge. It was justice, accountability, and the only way to honor my mom's memory after it had been so viciously violated. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away from this story, it's this. You don't have to accept mistreatment, even from family. You don't have to forgive people who hurt you deliberately and show no remorse. You don't have to take the high road when someone has pushed you so low that standing up for yourself requires scorched earth tactics. Sometimes, the only way to protect what's sacred is to fight back with everything you have. And if that makes you the villain in someone else's story, so be it. I'd rather be the villain who honored her mother's memory than the victim who let it be destroyed without consequence.